If you vote for me as dictator of Malaysia, not only will I make the trains run on time, I will also ensure that we have a society of propriety and morality, a nation of virility and strength. I will restore the morality of our Malaysian youth. I will ban vulgar and degenerate rap music. I will ban vulgar and degenerate Korean pop music. And I will ban vulgar and degenerate foods like pasta and Indomie. If only you give me a chance as dictator of Malaysia. So in my next video, I'm going to talk to you about the rising tide of fascism in Malaysia. Stay tuned, and don't forget to watch my video on Kelly's Castle. And I'll know if you haven't watched it, so make sure you watch it, yeah? And anybody who hasn't watched it will be forced to drink castor oil, because you guys are so full of shit! Hello! Welcome back to the brutal capitalist dictatorship of Kuala Lumpur. I hope you're having an amazing day, because if you're having an amazing day, I'm having an amazing day. If I'm having an amazing day, you should be having an amazing day. Now, first of all, I would like to apologize to all my followers for not having made a video over these last 3 weeks. Not only have I been very busy, I've also been dealing with a couple of personal issues of my own. Issues of a rather personal nature which I'd rather not disclose in public. In any case, I am now fit as a fiddle and once again ready to fight the reactionaries until the last day of capitalism. So I'm ready to continue making videos for all of you comrades of mine. So, are you going to welcome me back? Yes, you are. So please give me a rousing applause of welcome. Thank you very much. And let's begin. I think by now all of us are familiar with the brouhaha that occurred in Johor Bahru a couple of weeks ago, when a young man was accosted by an elderly gentleman for not fasting. And this young man, of course, was not Muslim. He was a Chinese chap. But this elderly gentleman said, "Show me your IC." He demanded to see the young man's IC, to which the young man replied that, "I'm not going to show it to you, because after all, you're not a policeman, right?" So, understandably, this elderly gentleman was not too pleased, and so he slapped the young man, and this was recorded on camera, and it became a police case. And while the elderly gentleman was prosecuted for assault, the fact remains that he took it upon himself to play vigilante in order to police his fellow Muslims who were not fasting. A couple of days ago, in a separate incident, a Chinese student was told by his teacher that if you don't want to speak Malay, you can go back to China. And this was reported to the authorities, and yes, the teacher was investigated for telling the student to go back to China. The student, who is a Malaysian citizen and whose family has been here for multiple generations, told to go back to China, a land that he has no cultural or emotional connection with. I mean, linguistically, yes, if he speaks Chinese, then yes, he has a linguistic connection with China, but certainly not a cultural one. In the same way, I speak English, but I don't have a cultural connection with Great Britain. But anyway, even though I'm the most British man in this country, I consider myself a proud Peranakan. But that's beside the point. The point is, these two incidences, among many others, are symptoms of a rising tide of fascism in Malaysian society. And if we are not careful, we will be overtaken by this rising tide of fascism. Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps the most pressing question of all is Is Malaysia a fascist country? Well, the answer is no, because countries are not inherently fascist or socialistic. Countries do not have any inherent socialism or inherent fascism or inherent capitalism in them. But rather, fascism is a political movement, an authoritarian, right-wing and militaristic political movement that arises from the contradictions between labor and capital that have not been resolved by class consciousness. In essence, I argue that every single worker who becomes a fascist is someone that we, the socialists, failed to get to our side. Yes, let me explain to you the political origins of fascism, and let me also explain to you how fascism plays out in Malaysia in comparison to the Italian context. Now, as for the origins of fascism, it's a really difficult ideology, if you can even call it an ideology, whose origins it is to pinpoint. See, when it comes to socialism, its origins, at least modern socialism, its origins are pretty easy to pinpoint. Modern socialists' origins are found in the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Modern capitalism's origins are found in the works of Adam Smith. But as for fascism, it's a very vague and murky territory when you want to get into fascism's origins. Now, many argue that people like Nietzsche and Giovanni Gentile, German and Italian philosophers of the 19th century, were the proto-fascists, the people who created the groundwork for fascism, although fascism as a political ideology only came around in the 20th century, really. But it's commonly agreed upon that the very first individual who actually put fascist ideas into practice was the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. And most fascists today consider Mussolini to be something of a cult figure, an individual who basically epitomized the idea of a perfect fascist. In fact, the word fascist originates from the Italian word fasci, which means bundles. But the word fasci in the 19th century didn't have the same connotation as the word fascist today. Because today, when people think about fascist, what they're thinking about is this authoritarian, strongman dictator who brutally suppresses any kind of dissent, like Chiang Kai-shek or Park Chung-hee or Mussolini or Pinochet or Dr. Mahathir. Think about any modern-day fascist you can think of. I mean, you could even say that to a certain extent, Lee Kuan Yew was a fascist. But, you know, the word fasci in the 19th century Italy meant something very different from the word fascist today. Because the word fasci actually meant bundles, and it referred to various competing left-wing political parties, such as the socialists and the anarchists. Now, Mussolini himself was an ardent Marxist. His father was an anarchist, and he was an ardent Marxist until the age of about 32 or 33, when he was kicked out of the Avanti newspaper that he was editing, and he was very bitter. He was kicked out because he advocated a more militaristic and nationalist stance for Italy. He had come to believe that, you know, Italians could no longer rely on the notion of global proletariat unity, and that Italians had to look out for themselves, basically. And so he wrote his writings in his 30s, his early 30s, start to take on a very militaristic and nationalist stance. And so this didn't sit well with the Marxists in his party, so they kicked him out of the party. And that was when he decided that he was no longer a Marxist. Yeah, he was the first why I left the left kind of guy. So he decided that, you know, even though he liked certain ideas of Karl Marx, he agreed with certain ideas of Marx, his form of socialism, and this is a very unpopular truth, but Mussolini considered himself to be a proud socialist throughout most of his life, would take on a non-Marxian form. And what is the non-Marxian form of socialism? That is correct. That is Italian National Socialism, aka fascist socialism, which takes on a, rather than taking on a proletarian character, takes on a nationalist character. Now, I know many of my fellow Marxists cringe when people talk about Umberto Eco's essay O Fascism, because Umberto Eco's version of fascism, or his idea of fascism, they argue, is an incomplete and superficial liberal understanding of fascism. Basically, the liberals' idea of fascism is restricted to the gun-toting MAGA supporters. While it's true that MAGA, Make America Great Again, is a fascist movement in its own right, the fact of the matter is that fascism is a very, very complex ideology, and it doesn't simply mean big, strong, macho men marching on the streets with guns or swords. That's basically how the Malaysian liberal perceives fascism as well. They see those guys in the countryside dressing up as Islamic warriors and marching with swords, and they say, ah, this is fascism. But fascism is a lot more complex than that. Yeah, that's a strain of fascism, you could argue, but fascism is a much more complex ideology than that. In fact, it's very difficult to even define what fascism really is. But I think whether we're talking about American fascism or Italian fascism or Malaysian fascism, or the most brutal of all, that would be German and Japanese fascism, most of these ideologies arise from a lack of class consciousness and the instilling of race or national consciousness. So German fascism's characteristics, and every single nation has its own variant of fascism. German fascism and Japanese fascism, as well as Malay fascism, takes on a race consciousness. Zionism itself is a form of fascism in the same way the local Malay fascism, or Ketuanan Melayu, or Malay supremacy, the idea that the Malays are the original inhabitants of this land and everybody else is a dirty invader. In the same way, the German fascism emphasized the idea that the Aryan people were the original inhabitants of Germany, and that the Jews were dirty invaders, pendatang. Well, this is basically a race-conscious kind of fascism. And Mussolini's fascism, on the other hand, was more of a nationalistic fascism. Now, make no mistake, Mussolini absolutely was a racist. He absolutely was. But he didn't have the same kind of bloodthirsty and genocidal tendencies as Adolf Hitler or the Japanese fascists. And another common trend that you'll notice about fascism all over the world is that, well, fascism always looks for a common enemy for everyone to unite against. Or rather, I should say, fascist leaders look for a common enemy in order to band against. For example, for Hitler, it was the Jews, the Jewish bankers who had stabbed Germany in the back during the war, whose loyalties were not with Germany. But Mussolini's fascism took on a very, very different sort of strain. Of course, it still was strongman and authoritarian and militaristic. But Mussolini's fascism, on the other hand, yeah, while he was a racist, it wasn't so much a genocidal fascism towards his own citizens, but rather this idea of the revival of the superior Roman people. For the record, Mussolini regarded Hitler as a dirty, degenerate Anglo-Saxon barbarian. You don't have to like your colleagues as long as you work with them. Mussolini and Hitler didn't actually like each other very much. I mean, Italian culture and German culture are as different as night and day, yeah? Italians actually have much more in common with Asians and Africans than they do with Anglo-Saxons. But the point is, Mussolini regarded himself as the next Caesar, basically the Caesar of the 20th century, who would revive the supreme Roman Empire and basically go on to expand the Italian people's living space and conquer less civilized people. Although basically Mussolini, rather than Hitler, didn't see race as something that was unchangeable. Or I should say that Mussolini, let me rephrase that, was more of a cultural chauvinist rather than a race fanatic. In the sense that, yes, he did consider other races to be inferior, but if you picked up his culture, you adopted his culture, and you spoke Italian, well, then he would consider you less inferior. While Hitler, no matter how German a Jewish person might be, still regarded them as only fit for the gas chambers. Not defending Mussolini, I'm just explaining the difference between Italian and German fascism. Now, if I had to describe local Malaysian fascists, there are two strains of Malaysian fascists. Let me first talk about those in my own race, the less talked about ones. The Sino-fascists, the Chinese ultras, the types that aren't terribly fond of bananas like myself. Those people are less concerned about external races attacking the Chinese. They are, but they're more concerned about enemies from within. So they have invented in their minds the enemy of the Chinese community, the internal enemy known as the banana. The Chinese who doesn't speak any Chinese, no Mandarin, no Hokkien, no Cantonese, nothing, and is too westernized. That type of Chinese is basically the boogeyman, the fascist boogeyman, because one common trend that you see in fascism is that they always need a boogeyman in order to galvanize the followers of theirs. That's how fascist populism works. So the boogeyman of these people is the evil banana, like Comrade Confucius, who hates other Chinese people and is basically a Han-Jian or a race traitor. So you can see a lot of banana hate on forums like Laoyat Forum, or, you know, and of course, now let's talk about the more mainstream form of fascism in Malaysia. I mean, there are Indian Malaysian fascists as well, but the thing is that Indians don't have enough economic or political power. So I'm not going to be spending a lot of time talking about Indian Malaysian fascists. I won't be spending time on the Indian fascists because they're so obscure. But there was an Indian Malaysian fascist who was attacking me a couple of months ago. A fellow named Dinesh Nair. Those of my long-term followers probably are aware with Mr. Nair, who is well acquainted with me. Of course, he has made up all sorts of untrue allegations about me, like he has claimed that my family are Chinese racists who discriminate against Indians. Not true, of course. I have Indian in-laws. He has claimed that I'm a pedophile, which is a very, very dangerous claim to make. Although, you know, nobody really takes him seriously, and I'm just too lazy to actually go and report on him. So yeah, but let's get to the most common or mainstream, or the most what was the word for it? Yes, the most iconic fascist in Malaysia, the Ketuanan Melayu, or the Malay supremacist sort of fascists. Now, if I had to describe these guys would basically be the Asian version of the Zionist, who believe that, you know, because of my DNA, the blood flowing in my veins, I am the lord of this land, if not realizing that, you know, their ancestors were actually peasants and slaves of the sultans. Well, this type of fascist I will describe as being 50% Hitler and 50% Mussolini, because while they have the Hitlerite tendency of believing that your blood is basically the same as your nationality, they don't believe that at the same time it seems to me that they are willing to accept people from minority groups, just like how Mussolini was willing to accept Ethiopians and other ethnic minorities if they were willing to get on board with this Roman restoration project. This type of fascist is pretty happy to accept ethnic minorities like Firdaus Wong or Ridwan T or Zakir Naik, you know, who basically renounce and give up their entire racial identity and their entire cultural identity and basically become just like any other Malay. That's so in the same way, if you were an Ethiopian or a Gypsy, well, but you gave up your Ethiopian or Gypsy identity and you just became Italian, well, with Mussolini you were good. Basically, he's not going to cook you in a gas chamber. But, you know, at the same time, yeah, it's we need to get down to why fascism springs up. I'm going to do a longer video on this, but in this video I'm going to try and explain to you what causes fascism to spring up. And it's very simple: lack of class consciousness. Rise to power did not occur in a vacuum. It was an accumulation of various socio-political factors which led to him seizing power as the dictator of Germany. But he definitely could not have seized power if he did not have the support of the masses. Now, of course, he didn't seize power democratically, but at the same time, he could not have seized power if he did not have a majority of Germans who supported him. Now, why did most German people support Hitler, you might ask? Were most German people evil? No, of course not. The thing is that at the end of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was bankrupt. It was forced to pay millions of marks in war reparations to the other countries, even though it hadn't started the war. And basically, people lost their life savings overnight. Entire families went bankrupt overnight. You know, you had to have an entire wheelbarrow of money in order to buy a loaf of bread. And people were, well, living in very, very dire hardship. So the German leaders, they perceived, at the end of the war, had failed them. And Hitler basically entered politics, and he galvanized the German people using the same kind of prejudices, using common prejudices that they already had. The idea that the Jews were a separate and foreign and alien invader, and that they are the ones who are hoarding all the wealth in this country, and it was they who stabbed Germany in the back. So we see the same thing in Malaysia when fascists of this country point to the Chinese, and they say, for example, that the Chinese are hoarding all the wealth of this country. The Chinese are arrogant. That's basically the race baiting that our politicians do. Now, it's not just Malay politicians who do it, even Dinesh does it, okay? But this sort of race baiting or this sort of racial populism wouldn't work so well with a society that's well fed and well clothed. But the reality is that most Germans were so desperate that they were happy to follow any leader who would promise them bread, work and freedom from debt slavery. And that was what Hitler was willing to do. If political leaders cannot promise or are not addressing the class consciousness of the people, that is where fascists step in, you know. And if political leaders do not address the material concerns of the little guy, well, that's where the fascist leader steps in and says, I am your friend and I will fight for you, and this person is your enemy, and it's because of this person that you're suffering from hardship. Mussolini's strongman authoritarian dictatorship, on the other hand, well, it also gained a lot of support from angry, frustrated and disenfranchised young men who came to be known as his black shirts. Now, my professor at the University of Adelaide was an elderly Italian man, and his grandfather was one of Mussolini's black shirts. And until the day he died, his grandfather loved Mussolini. Was his grandfather an evil person? No, of course not. Probably not. But the reality was that Mussolini was able to uplift his material conditions. Mussolini actually got results for him. So people are less driven by ideology in so much as they are driven by material results. You can talk about systemic change all you want, but if you cannot promise results, or if you don't bring results, well, people naturally gravitate towards fascism if they think fascism brings results. Because people don't have the luxury of being noble when it comes to feeding their families and keeping a roof over their heads. So I suppose we get to the more pressing question as to why are Malaysians gravitating towards fascism? Why are they gravitating towards authoritarian strongman leaders like Hadi Awang in PAS, who are threatening to take away our democracy? Well, it's because the left, as I've said, what counts as the left in Malaysia has been utterly incompetent in resolving the material conditions of the people. I'm not talking about the PSM, but the PSM, the Party Socialist Malaysia, is still a grassroots, or it's still a growing party. It's still a growing party. It's the only principled party in this country, but it's still a growing party. So, but what counts as the mainstream Malaysian left, or the Pakatan Harapan, has done a piss-poor job uplifting the material conditions of the Malaysian people. And many of our liberals, rather than empathizing with the frustration of the rural working class, often end up punching down on them, regarding them as backward and reactionary and beyond salvation, as I've explained time and again in my videos. So naturally, this sort of class resentment and this sort of material frustration that results from a sense of anxiety, economic anxiety, and not being able to feed one's family pushes people to the right wing. Say what you want about groups like PAS, but they don't punch down on poor people. No, they don't. And they're not advocating neoliberal economic policies. But the fact is that, yes, fascism is basically the dark force of Marxism, just like the Sith are the dark force of the Jedis, basically. Many fascists at one point were once Marxists, but then they fell out of love with Marxism. But they still retain that populist tendency. So what fills the void when you no longer have dialectical materialism guiding your worldview? Well, then you start gravitating towards nationalism and utopianism, and that creates an ugly concoction which leads to fascism. So what does the fascist or the mainstream Malaysian fascist want, really? Well, they basically want a neo-caliphate where, everybody is a Malay, everybody's basically practices Islam, and all other religious identities and all other cultural identities are sort of like erased. That's what they want. But they didn't just spring up out of nowhere. They sprung up because the left was so utterly incompetent that basically, because the Malaysian left is so obsessed with identity politics, is so obsessed with race and culture war and gender issues, and not really focused on instilling class consciousness in the Malaysian proletariat, the fascists have successfully won over the Malaysian proletariat. Or let me not sound like a defeatist. The fascists are running laps around us, winning over the Malaysian proletariat because they're actually taking populism and they're actually taking this seriously. Yes, the fascists actually understand the proletariat better than the Malaysian left does, because the Malaysian left is much closer to a quintessential Western liberal. So yes, we can criticize the Malaysian proletariat for gravitating towards fascism, and of course we can condemn the fascists for deceiving the Malaysian proletariat with false consciousness and reactionary ideology. But ultimately, we on the left have to look at ourselves. Are we working hard to instill class consciousness and class solidarity in the Malaysian workers, regardless of race or religion? Or are we pitting the races and genders and sexualities against each other, while the fascists are actually speaking to the hearts of the masses because they focus on issues that actually matter? Now, I'm not saying racism or gender discrimination or LGBT discrimination don't matter, but the primary contradiction is class. And this is something that the Malaysian left seems allergic to address. And that is what gives power to the fascists, because the Malaysian left doesn't really speak to the material interests of the average Malaysian worker. Malaysia has two choices: socialism or fascism. Class consciousness is being developed in the Malaysian proletariat, but we have to ask ourselves, which direction do we want this class consciousness to pivot to? Towards socialism or towards fascism? And from the looks of the mainstream Malaysian left wing, I am sorry to say that we are going to pivot towards fascism, because there's not enough effort being made by the non-socialist Malaysian left to try and instill class consciousness in the people. I should call them the liberal left. Yes, yeah, I mean, they might like socialist ideals, but the mainstream Malaysian left is too wrapped up in race and gender and culture war identity politics that they miss the big picture of uniting the working class of all races against the bourgeoisie. And yet, and basically, the fascists are, as I've said, making laps around us in that regard. Because the fascists actually understand how to talk to the people. You know why Trump was popular in America? Do you know why Mussolini was popular in Italy? Do you know why Hitler was popular in Germany? Even though they might not have been sincere, and they probably were not sincere about helping the people, at least they understood to appeal to the material conditions of the people in order to get their support. So unless the Malaysian left is willing to take a class line, is willing to place class as the primary contradiction in all of this, I don't see how they're going to overcome the rising tide of fascism in this country if they keep wallowing in identity politics and constantly ignoring the proletarian class line of galvanizing the proletariat to play their historical role in basically becoming the next ruling class. Unless they do that, I don't see how they're going to beat fascism. So I'm very, very worried. Yes, I am worried about the future of this country, but I put more blame on the left rather than the right for its failure to appeal to the Malaysian masses. And like I say again, I hope that, Malaysia, we only have two choices: socialism or fascism. Make your choice. Thank you. Have a great day.